In this video, we will learn about dioxin. What is dioxin? And is it dangerous? Hear this out. Dioxin are a class of polychlorinated aromatic compounds. Commonly compound known are polychlorinated dibenzopdioxins, polychlorinated dibenzofurans, and polychlorinated biphenyls. Dioxin is formed by burning chlorine-based chemical compound with hydrocarbons. None of these can be made by living organism because of high lipid solubility of these compounds, but easily incorporated into lipid-containing tissues of fish, animals, and human. It can occur naturally or as byproduct of industrial activities through a variety of incineration processes. Mainly, it is byproduct of industrial practices. For examples, metal smelting, combustion sources, and chemical manufacturing sources, while in natural sources such as forest fires and volcanoes. Although dioxins are formed locally, their environmental dispersion is global. Dioxins are prevalent in environment all around the world. These substances are found in the highest concentration in some soils and sediments. PCD and PCDF may exist in relatively pure form as contaminants of others' products and as adhering to particulates. Is dioxin harmful? Yes, dioxin is harmful. Long-term storage and inappropriate disposal of this material may result in the release of dioxins into the environment and contamination of human and animal food supplies. Today, people are exposed to dioxins primarily by eating food, in particular animals' products, contaminated by these chemicals. Dioxin are absorbed and stored in fat tissue and, therefore, accumulate in the food chain. Dietary intake as the main tract of human exposure to dioxin. Sources of human exposure to dioxin includes food intakes, drinking water, and air inhalation. More than 90% of human exposure is through food, such as poultry meat, eggs, dairy product, fish, and shellfish. Assessment of dioxin. The U.S. average daily intake of international dioxin toxic equivalents for an adult weighing 65 kilograms was calculated between 18 and 192 picograms toxicity equivalent, or 0.3 to 3.0 picograms per kilograms of body weight. Next, how dioxin can be harmful. Dioxin is dissolved in fat in nature and not easily can broken down because of their chemical stability. They tend to accumulate in fatty tissues and passed up the food chain from plants to animal to human and estimate to be 7 to 11 years of half-life in the body. The recycling of waste product into animal feed and animal food production chains can cause the real problem. The higher an animal is in the food chain, the higher the concentration of dioxins. Dioxin exposure are highly sensitive to developing fetus, newborn with rapidly developing organ system, high exposure of dioxins in diet, and worker which work in hazardous waste site, pulp, and paper industry. What are the effects of dioxin on human health? For a short-term exposure of human, high levels of dioxin may result in skin lesions such as chloracne, patch darkening of the skin, and altered liver function. And for the long-term exposure of dioxins to human linked to impairment of the immune system, developing of nervous system, endocrine system, and reproductive function. Then, we will going to discover cases regarding dioxin contamination. Many countries test their food for dioxins. This has resulted in early detection of contaminants and prevented a larger scale damage. In many cases, dioxin contamination is introduced through contaminated animal feed. For example, higher dioxins levels in milk or in animal feed have been traced back to clay, fat, or citrus pulp pellets used in animal feed manufacturing. First, in late 2008, Ireland withdrew numerous tons of pork products after dioxin levels in tests of pork were found to be up to 200 times the permissible limit. This resulted in one of the greatest food recalls in history due to chemical contamination. Ireland's risk assessments revealed no public health concerns. In the contamination feed was found to be the source of the contamination. According to the Food Safety Authority, the dioxin entered the food chain after pig feed from one supplier was contaminated with some form of industrial oil. While just 10% of Ireland's pig meat was contaminated, it was processed and combined with other meat, resulting widespread contamination. These compound dioxins take a long time to accumulate in the body, so a relatively short period of exposure would have little impact on the total body burden. One would have to be exposed to the high levels for a long period of time. There would be a health risk. High amounts would have to be subjected for a long period of time. In 1999, high levels of dioxins were discovered in Belgian poultry and eggs. Following that, dioxin-contaminated animal-based food like poultry, eggs, and pork was discovered in a number of additional nations. Animal feeds tainted with the legally discarded PCB-based waste industrial oil was identified as the source. Although any country can be affected, the majority of the contamination cases have been documented in industrialized countries, where appropriate food contamination monitoring, increased knowledge of the threat, and improved regulatory measures are in place to detect dioxin concerns. In 1976, a serious accident in chemical factory in Seveso, Italy resulted in the emissions of large amount of dioxins. A cloud of dangerous chemicals, dioxins, was released into the air, eventually contaminating a 15 square kilometers area inhabited by 37,000 people. Extensive research is being conducted in the impacted population to identify the long-term human health impacts of this tragedy. In this case, children with colorectal, and the creation or expansion of health registries such as birth defect and cancer registries to capture information on health effects that could manifest years after initial exposure. Many colorectal cases were diagnosed in Seveso residents, especially in children. The dioxin levels also associated with decreased male and female fertility in Seveso, and increased risk for cancers and cardiometabolic outcomes. Last but not least, what should we do to reduce the risk of dioxin exposure? Thus, due to highly toxic, dioxin exposure should be prevented and controlled by environmental control like proper incineration of contaminated material. Second, good controls and practices during primary production, processing, distribution, and sale. All are required for safe food production. Third, secondary contamination must be avoided throughout the food chain in addition to source-directed actions to prevent dioxin emissions. Lastly, consuming a low-fat goods, removing fat from meat and meat products, lowering the quantity of animal feed used in food preparation, and utilizing cooking methods that reduce fat such as boiling and baking, which are all beneficial approaches to reduce the dietary dioxin exposure. Thus, dioxin occur as a complex mixture in the environment and in food. In order to assess the potential risk of the whole mixture, the concept of toxic equivalence has been applied to this group of contaminants to avoid from excessive exposure to contaminants.